I have a Minolta MC Rokkor-PF 50mm f1.7 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling fully. This lens is pretty much identical to the later MC Rokkor-X PF. You can see that really the only difference on these two lenses, besides this one being a little bit worse cosmetic condition and missing things like the red bump and having slightly more yellowish numbers, this one over here, the Rokkor-X, just has a slightly different looking name ring, and I think with most of the other differences, maybe it has a slightly different coating, but I believe most of them are just cosmetic to update the branding to go with the Rokkor-X branding on that later one. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens today, getting access to the elements, the diaphragm on its own, and also removing most of the body sections so that those can be cleaned individually. So starting off here, we'll get access to the back of the diaphragm, which is useful if the diaphragm has just a little bit of oil on it that needs to be cleaned off. So looking here at the back of the lens, you can see the backmost element here, and then there are two sets of little black rings around this back element. One on the interior here, this little little ring going around here with little 4 divots. And then there's an outer black ring with 2 divots on either side right there. So what you want to do is use a spanning wrench on the outermost divots of this black ring to remove the back element fully. The inner divots are used to remove the ring that's actually holding in the backmost glass element itself instead of this entire back group. So it does allow you to disassemble those and clean inside the back lens group. Alright, so there's the back lens group right there. And now if I adjust the aperture, you can see I've exposed the back of the diaphragm. So real easy, like on a lot of these 50mm Rokkor lenses, to get access to the back of the diaphragm here. And if there's just a small amount of oil, you can clean it off okay, just by exposing the back or the front of the diaphragm. So now we'll actually expose the front of the diaphragm. Looking here at the front of the lens, you can see on this name ring here, it's just kind of a cheap plastic name ring, which is a little bit disappointing. There are 2 divots on either side here and here. So I'll use another spanning wrench to remove the name ring. Alright, so there's the little plastic name ring there. And now we've exposed 6 screws going around here, or actually, I believe 8 screws going around here. And these 8 screws are holding in 2 parts. The first set of screws on the top here, so the ones that are kind of sitting up a little bit more, are holding on this black ring on the front section here, which is what the filters normally screw into. So we'll remove those 4 first, the ones on top of the black ring. Alright, so that whole black ring will just lift right off there. And that also gives us a little bit more room to work with to remove the front element. You can actually remove the front element without removing the black ring if you want to skip a step, but it does help to remove it so you have a little bit more room to work with here. So looking at this front element, again, there are 2 sets of divots on it. There's the intersection here with the kind of stepped ring going around here, and it has 4 little divots going around there. And then on the exterior here, there's another set of divots, 2 I believe, and this is what's actually holding in the entire front element here. The inner rings, the divots on the stepped ring, that's holding in just the front element of the lens. So we actually want to remove all the front glass of the lens by going on the outer rings so that we can get access to the front of the diaphragm. And like on the back glass piece, by actually removing some of these rings in here, you can clean inside of the elements here. If there is significant fungus on the inside, usually I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's easier to introduce more gunk into the lens than you actually end up removing. Now we've exposed both sides of the diaphragm, and the actual removing of the diaphragm so that it can be cleaned as best as possible is not too much difficult either. So looking back down, there are the other set of 4 screws going around here on top of this brass colored ring now. So we'll undo those 4 and then we'll be able to just lift off the entire diaphragm section after doing that. So lift off kind of this brassy colored looking washer thing here first. And now the entire center section of the lens will just slide out. At this stage you may also want to mark where it's lining up, but it doesn't really matter too much because this piece, the diaphragm, just kind of loosely fits in place and we'll have to lock it down in a specific position later. You can pretty well judge how it's supposed to fit back together, but if you want to get it back together perfectly, you should mark where things were lining up before. And now we've actually exposed the diaphragm piece here, the diaphragm mechanism. which is just a very simple piece. It has no springs or anything. It's just pretty much the diaphragm and its housing, and then along with the rest of the lens body here. So I'm not actually going to disassemble the diaphragm, and I've shown how you would do it on some other videos, but I will describe real quick how you would actually go about disassembling the diaphragm here. So on the diaphragm piece, you can see that there's this front ring, or this front cap right here, or top section, kind of a black color, and then on the back section there's a back plate under here as well. So the actual diaphragm blades are sandwiched between these two plates, and they move back and forth. So what's holding on the front plate and what's keeping everything locked in position are a set of these little 3 set screws going around here. So little set screws on the exterior. You can loosen these up, and after you do that, you can then push out the entire diaphragm mechanism as a single unit. So both the front piece, the blades, and the back plate all together. And that allows you to then disassemble the diaphragm if you want, and clean it pretty well. If there's just a minor amount of grease on the diaphragm or oil on the diaphragm, you can clean it in the housing as well. But sometimes if there's quite a bit of gunk on the diaphragm blades that's really preventing them from moving, actually taking apart the diaphragm and cleaning the blades individually is necessary. And I show how to do that in some other videos for 50mm Rokkor lenses. So we'll set that aside. And now returning back to the body section here, because we actually want to remove some of these body sections so that they can be cleaned on their own as well. So looking at the back of the lens, I'm going to go in and start removing some of these back sections, since these are usually what you would want to clean. And if there are any mechanical problems with the lens, this is where they would typically be. So on the back section near the mounting plate, there's a silver ring running around the exterior here with 3 little screws that are holding it on. So that's the first ring we're going to remove. Now this silver ring should just slide out like that. And that reveals another set of screws on this ring below, so the aperture control ring. You'll notice if I spin this around, there's these 4 little gaps or cutouts in the aperture control ring. And if you spin it so that it's at fully open, 1.7 right now, you can see the 4 little screws on the next level below. And this will allow us to detach the entire focusing mechanism from the aperture control ring. And that also exposes all the mechanical workings of the lens on the inside so that those can be nicely cleaned and maintained if there are any problems with those. So mechanically, this lens is very simple. It's almost identical to a lot of the other Rokkor lenses, and it's the exact same setup as the 50mm Rokkor-X version of this lens. I'll talk a little bit more on how things are getting coupled during the reassembly, but let's take a look real quick at this piece a little bit more. So to actually separate, right now we have the aperture control ring and the mounting plate, and then also this depth of field scale indicator, and then all the mechanical sections on the inside. So usually what you'd want to do at this stage is either maintain the mechanical sections if there's something wrong with those, or actually remove the aperture control ring to clean it on its own. And removing the aperture control ring is a little bit harder than on some other lenses, because you'll notice that there's this plate, this metal plate over here, going from the outside of the aperture control ring on top to the inside here in the mechanical section. And that's actually the aperture control curve, which is what, when you move the ring back and forth, it moves the little post here up and down to adjust the aperture. And I'll talk more on how that's getting coupled together later. But that plate is preventing, or the curve is preventing us from actually removing the aperture control ring from the outside here. So we have to remove that plate first to be able to remove the aperture control ring. So the aperture control curves is just held in place by 2 little screws over here. So we can loosen these up. Now the curve, if we work it back and forth, just kind of push on this side over here, it will fall out of place and we can remove it fully. What this allows us to do is then slide off the entire aperture control ring. Be careful, because there is the little ball bearing right under the indicator over here somewhere that makes the clicking sound. So I'll just carefully slide the thing off there. So there's the little ball bearing right over here. So I'll remove that just so it's safe. And now the aperture control curve, or the aperture control ring, can be cleaned on its own if you want to. The actual depth of field scale indicator ring is still integrated into the mechanical sections, but there's not really much you can do about that to clean it. Finally, we'll also look at this focusing mechanism here. So I'm going to focus in real quick. I'm going to remove the outer focusing ring, which is what you grip onto. So this black ring on the exterior of the lens. This is only really necessary, and I would only recommend doing this if you really do need to clean this exterior black ring, because once you remove it, you have to properly zero the lens back to infinity, because there's nothing really indicating where this should get properly lined up. So this black ring is just held in place by 3 little screws, and each of these screws also has a little washer that goes with it as well. So now I can actually remove this exterior ring here, so it can be cleaned completely on its own. And I also have the just focusing mechanism on its own. Alright, so that has the lens pretty much fully disassembled here. So we have things like the optics, the front and back optics here, which can further be disassembled by undoing some of those little rings in there, separate from some of the various body sections like the focusing ring here and the aperture control ring. And then also separate from the mechanical sections like the back section, the mounting plate with all the mechanical couplings in there, and then also the focusing mechanism itself, which can also be further disassembled. But now at least you have access to that piece so that it can be maintained if the focusing is rough. So now starting on the reassembly of this lens. The reassembly is pretty straightforward. There's nothing too difficult, just a few minor annoyances. So we'll start here with the mounting plate section, and we'll get the aperture control ring back roughly in where the position that it needs to go into. So looking here, the aperture control ring itself is just going to slide into place. You'll notice that over by the 50mm indicator right here, there's a screw sticking out, and then on the actual aperture control ring, there's a cutout over on this side right here. And that cutout goes over the screw, and the screw is actually what's limiting how far you can turn in either direction. So 2 other things have to line up to actually get the aperture control ring fully in place, besides that little screw over there. So we have the ball bearing, which I believe goes right, let me find where it goes. It goes on the aperture control ring itself. So the ball bearing is going to go right here and get pushed up against the set of grooves over here to create the clicking sound as you move the ring back and forth. And then the other thing that we'll have to get lined up after all of this is to get the aperture control curve back in place as well. So let's just start by getting the aperture control ring roughly in position. I'll grab the ball bearing over here, stick the ball bearing in the little indentation where it goes on the aperture control ring. And now I'll find where the screw is over here and find the cutout, which is over here, and make sure everything is lining up properly. So taking the back lens plate here, I'll actually press it up against the ball bearing a little bit and then slide the rest of the aperture control ring on. And if everything went properly, when you turn the aperture control ring back and forth, it should make that clicking sound. With the aperture control ring itself back in place, there's nothing actually holding it in position. It's just kind of loosely set on there. And we have to get the aperture control curve back in its position. So the curve right here, you'll notice it kind of has a bent to it, or a bend in it, looking over here. So we want it so that it's angled upward, it's bending up. And on the inside of the lens, I'm going to find where I hit the stop down lever on the back of the lens, you'll notice that this little black bar or crescent shaped piece moves on the inside here. And there's a little silver post on the top of it. So I want the aperture control curve to go behind that post, and then I want the other side of it to stick through. Let me get that first part in position there. I want the other side of it to stick through so that it's visible in the indentation where the screws were attaching it before. So looking right there. And it may help to actually adjust the aperture control ring a little bit. All right, and now when you have this part showing through over here, you'll reattach it with the 2 screws that were holding it in place originally. So I'm just going to get the screws lightly in place first. This is actually one area where you can adjust how the aperture opens and closes because these screws are not locking into a definite screw hole. So you can actually move the curve up and down to slightly adjust how it's being controlled. So just to explain a little bit more on how the actual aperture control works. On the back part of the lens here, there's this black piece going around here, the crescent shaped piece, and that's what's going to hook into the aperture directly. It actually has this little pocket right here, which is going to go, which this post on the aperture is going to hook into. So this black piece with its little pocket is going to control the aperture. And there are two ways it can be controlled. One, of course, is with the stop-down lever, so just hitting this little lever on the back here. That moves the crescent-shaped piece back and forth. And then the other way is by adjusting the aperture control ring. And when you adjust the aperture control ring, you'll see that the aperture control curve we just installed, right back here, is moving back and forth. But this little post is fixed in place. And as we move the aperture control ring back and forth, that little post actually ends up moving up and down and moving the black crescent-shaped piece back and forth. So therefore, by actually adjusting where the screws and the aperture control curve are locked into place back here, you can adjust how this little post moves up and down. That's one area where you can adjust how the aperture is controlled. The other is actually when we're reinstalling the aperture a little bit later on. So continuing on with the disassembly of the lens here, just going in a slightly different order this time around to make things a little bit easier. So looking at the back of the focusing mechanism, you'll notice it's pretty flat except for this little set of screws sticking out over here on the back of the focusing mechanism. And then in the actual aperture control, or in the actual main lens body here, there's a little cutout, and those screws are going to go into the cutout over there. That's a rough guide, so get that lined up first. And then looking at the back of the aperture with the aperture control set to 1.7 here, I'm going to find where the 4 little screw holes down in the cutouts here line up with the screw holes on the focusing mechanism. So that looks pretty good. Now I'll just reinstall the 4 screws going around. Okay, and now I'll just reinstall the lens cap to get a better surface to work on. We'll leave off reinstalling this silver ring until a little bit later in case we do have to adjust the aperture control curve once we reinstall the aperture. So now we actually are going to reinstall the aperture here. So the aperture piece is very simple. Just has this little control lever right here. And as I mentioned, the control lever is going to go down into the little pocket on the metal piece down here, and that's how things are going to be coupled together. So lining it up, I'll just slide things in from the back like that. So there's nothing actually locking the diaphragm in place here. It can just be spun back and forth freely. To actually lock it down, we have to use this metal washer, the brass washer, and the 4 screws to fasten it in position somewhere. So let me get this washer set up first with the 4 screws in it, going around every other screw. And then I'll just pick 4 of these and get this in place. And I'll just loosely tighten down these screws at first, because I'm going to then spin around the aperture to find the correct position. You can see that the lens is not properly adjusting. It looks like there are actually 2 things going wrong here. So part 1 is that even when it's fully open, you can still see some of the blades. And then when I step it down, it goes almost directly down to, even here at 4, 5, or 8, it's almost all the way fully closed right now, and then it kind of opens back up later on. So part of this is definitely that the aperture itself is reattached in the wrong position, and then part of it is that the aperture control curve is probably out of position as well. So first off, let's get the aperture in a more reasonable position. So I'll just loosen these up slightly. And now I can grab the inside of the aperture. I have the lens set to 1.7 right now, and I can now spin around the aperture until the blades are just barely visible and disappearing off the edge of the lens here. And I'll try locking that down, and let's see. That's a little bit better for the upper edge, but still bad for the lower edge. And again, part of that may be the aperture control curve itself misbehaving. Right, so now I have the aperture just off the center of the lens, so you can't see it at all when it's fully open. But now the actual lens is still not stopping down fully. And this is probably caused by the aperture control curve right here not behaving properly. So I'm going to loosen up these 2 screws, and you see it kind of jumped back in position there, which looks like a good sign. And now I'll just loosen down the screws again in this new position. Alright, so it's looking much more smooth now in how the aperture control curve is moving. It's still a little bit, maybe a little bit large right now, so I'll readjust the aperture on the front section and how that's locking down, but I think the aperture control curve itself is looking pretty good now. So the things you want to look for is that when it's fully closed, obviously that there's still some ability for light to get through. And then when it's fully open, none of the lens blades are visible or aperture blades are visible. And also you want to make sure that each step of the aperture adjustment moves the diaphragm a little bit and actually goes smaller or larger. So make sure that each step does something. And that's looking pretty good. So I'll just tighten this down the rest of the way. And now we'll also reinstall the front glass piece here. It just screws in place. The reason for doing it in this particular order is that we actually want to reinstall the focusing ring last, because that will allow us to zero the lens more easily. And I'll use just use a spanning wrench here to just lock down this front element a little bit better. Also reinstall the back element here. So this little back element also just screws in place. And use a spanning wrench again to lock this down. And to finish up the back reassembly, we'll now reinstall this silver ring since we don't need access to the aperture control curve anymore. So on the silver ring here, going to find the side with the larger section, or the side with the larger part, kind of the lip section going down, and then just slide it in place and just tighten down these 3 little set screws again in any position to get this in place. You don't want it pushing up too hard against the aperture control ring, but you do want it snugly against the aperture control ring and flush with the mounting plate on the back section here. Okay, so that has the entire back of the lens reassembled now. So now we actually have to reinstall the focusing ring, and this is one area which can be a little bit more challenging just because there's no definite position that the focusing ring locks into when you're reattaching it, and you actually have to go outside and zero the lens. I won't actually do that here, but I'll describe the entire process. So looking here at the focusing ring, there's a little cutout section in the interior of the focusing ring going around kind of in here between these 2 notches. And then there's a little screw over here by the focusing indicator, and that screw is what's limiting how far you can focus in either direction. So to start off here, I'm just going to get the little screw going in between those 2 cutouts on the focusing ring so that it's focusing between the minimum focusing distance, 0.5 meters, and infinity. Next up, I'm going to just get the 4 little screws that were going into the focusing ring, or the 3 little screws and their washers back in place. So right now the lens is completely optically reassembled, and you can actually mount it on your camera too, and it would work just fine. And this is how you would actually optically focus the lens and zero it to infinity. So you would take this lens outside in its current state, mount it on your camera, and try focusing on some very distant object. So with the lens on your camera, you would spin this around until the object in the distance is in focus. And once that happens, you've actually physically focused the lens to be optically focused to infinity. You would then loosen up the sections in here. So let's say right now it was optically focused to infinity and it was at like 1.5 right now on the indicator. So you would loosen up the sections in here and loosen up the 3 screws here, and then spin around the actual focusing ring on the exterior so that it's physically indicating that it's focused to infinity as well when the lens is optically focused to infinity. And once that's the case, you can lock everything back down and know that the lens is properly zeroed back to infinity, so that when it's indicating infinity over here, it's optically focused to infinity as well. I'll just assume for the reassembly here that it is physically focused to infinity right now and continue on. So you have to get one last step is to get the lens hood here, or the filter ring holder, back in place. So it has 4 little cutouts in the interior sections here that go over the 4 screws that were previously installed, and then it has 4 more screws of its own that line up with screw holes on the bottom section. And finally, just reinstalling the plastic name ring here. It just screws in position. And you can use a spanning wrench to actually lock it down the rest of the way. Okay, so that has the entire reassembly of the lens complete now. You can check and make sure that things like the diaphragm are adjusting properly, focusing is working, and that everything else is looking good. This lens is pretty much identical to the Rokkor-X version, the MC Rokkor-X PF 50mm. There may be a few minor differences here and there, but I think pretty much that the Rokkor-X version is just a slight rebranding of the regular Rokkor-PF version. They're both easy lenses to take apart, probably some of the easier lenses of the 50mm Rokkor series, and internally they're laid out pretty in a way that makes it easy enough to identify problems and actually repair them. They use higher quality metal components, unlike some of the later MD lenses, and all the components are very separated as well, so you can actually do things like get the aperture on its own and get the focusing mechanism on its own very easily, making this overall a very repairable lens.